The air was crisp that morning as tourists gathered in front of Buckingham Palace, eager to catch a glimpse of the iconic British Royal Guard in their traditional red coats and tall black bearskin hats. Among the crowd, there was a sense of reverence and awe. Everyone knew the guards were highly disciplined soldiers known for their stillness and unwavering focus. It was an unspoken rule to respect the guards, who stood like statues, their faces unreadable, their eyes fixed forward. For most, this was a moment to watch in quiet admiration. But not everyone in the crowd felt the same way. Somewhere near the front, a woman with a loud voice and a bright pink scarf, who seemed to relish being the center of attention, nudged her way closer to the guard on duty. She was an American tourist, and her voice carried over the soft murmur of the onlookers. Her laugh was sharp, almost mocking, and her eyes glinted with mischief as she studied the stoic face of the young black guard before her. The guard, whose name was Marcus, could feel the woman's gaze. It wasn't unusual for people to stare at him, but something about her presence unsettled him. He was well trained to ignore distractions, but the energy this woman radiated was different, bold, invasive, and tinged with something darker. "Come on, what's the big deal?" she sneered, looking to her friend, who was filming her antics on his phone. She took a step closer to Marcus, leaning in so close that he could smell the sharp perfume she wore. "They say you're not allowed to react, huh? No matter what." Marcus remained silent, his expression unchanging. Inside, however, he felt the tension build. His duty required him to endure all manner of teasing and taunts without reacting, and he was used to it. But he also knew there were limits. The palace guidelines were clear about the level of disrespect they tolerated, and he was trained to respond appropriately if anyone crossed the line. The woman, however, seemed oblivious to any boundaries as she continued her taunts. "You must be bored just standing here all day," she cheered, waving her hand in front of his face. Not even a blink. "Oh, you're good." Her laughter was met with a few nervous chuckles from the crowd, who watched in uncomfortable silence. Then in an instant, her expression shifted, and before anyone could react, her hand shot out, landing a quick, sharp slap against Marcus's shoulder. A stunned silence fell over the crowd, and even her friend with the camera stopped laughing, his phone lowering slightly as he registered the gravity of what had just happened. For a brief second, Marcus's face remained impassive. But in that heartbeat, something inside him stirred, a sense of pride, dignity, and an understanding that he was not there to be demeaned. He could feel the eyes of the crowd on him, waiting to see how he would respond. The shock in the woman's face was unmistakable as she waited, suddenly uncertain. Marcus took a deep breath, his mind racing through his training, the strict guidelines, and the respect he had always upheld in his role. But he also knew that today there would be a consequence for the woman's actions. Just as she began to smirk, thinking he wouldn't dare react, he took a single, measured step forward. The woman's expression turned from shock to panic as she realized she had misjudged him entirely. This was not going to end the way she had imagined. She wasn't prepared for the reality of what she had provoked. The crowd held its breath, eyes darting between the guard and the tourist, each person wondering what would happen next. Marcus, the royal guard, maintained his composure, though there was a spark in his gaze now, a slight shift that only those closest to him could see. It wasn't anger or impatience, but a deep, quiet dignity, one that spoke of years of discipline, of countless hours spent perfecting the ability to stand firm, unaffected by the world around him. But this woman, with her brazen laughter and careless smirk, had crossed a line he didn't expect her to. Her slap wasn't just an insult to him. It felt like an attack on everything he stood for, an attempt to belittle the pride he felt in his role. Marcus was no stranger to mocking or rude tourists, but this incident was unlike any other. It wasn't only her behavior that stung, but also the underlying disrespect she held in her tone and actions, as if she believed she could treat him however she pleased simply because of his uniform, his duty, and perhaps even his appearance. The woman didn't seem to understand the gravity of what she had done. She looked back at her friend with a triumphant grin, as if she'd just pulled off a harmless prank. Her friend, however, appeared uneasy. His phone was still in hand, recording the moment, but he looked from Marcus to the crowd, as if unsure whether to keep filming or to step in and defuse the situation. "Come on, it's all in good fun," she said, her laughter ringing out again, though this time it sounded forced, almost hollow. Her confidence wavered when she noticed that the crowd wasn't laughing with her. In fact, most people were now staring at her in disbelief or even disgust. She tried to brush it off, waving her hand dismissively, but there was a flicker of unease in her eyes as Marcus held her gaze, his expression unyielding. From where he stood, Marcus could sense the crowd's shift in energy. People who had been curious onlookers were now actively engaged, silently supporting him, even as he continued to stand tall, rooted in his place. He knew his position came with expectations, a duty to represent not only himself, but the heritage and honor of the Royal Guard. But he was also a human being, and the slap had not only disrespected his role, but had cut into his own sense of worth. As he glanced at the faces in the crowd, he saw a young girl standing beside her father, her eyes wide with confusion and concern. For a brief second, Marcus thought of his own family. His mother, who had proudly watched him take his oath, would have been hurt to see this. His father, a former military man himself, had taught him to wear his pride and respect like armor. And yet, here was a woman who seemed to think it was all a joke, a game to see just how far she could push someone before they snapped. The tourist was beginning to sense the shift, too. Her smirk faded slightly as she felt the eyes of the crowd on her, no longer friendly or amused. She tried to laugh it off, making a show of shrugging, but the tension in the air was thick, and she could feel it pressing down on her. For a brief second, she glanced at Marcus, maybe expecting him to speak, to brush it off as harmless. But Marcus said nothing. His silence was louder than any words could have been. The friend with the phone shifted awkwardly, lowering the camera a bit more as if hoping to avoid further attention. He mumbled something to her, maybe suggesting they move along, but she ignored him, too stubborn to back down. In her mind, she hadn't done anything wrong. She was just having a bit of fun, testing the limits of what she'd heard about the Royal Guards. But now, standing face to face with Marcus, who hadn't budged or reacted, she began to feel the weight of her actions. Still, she wasn't quite ready to admit fault. Instead, she turned back to her friend, gesturing at Marcus with an exaggerated eye roll. "See, he's just a statue. He can't even react," she said loudly, hoping to regain control of the situation. But as she spoke, her voice lacked the confidence it had before, and there was a slight tremble, a crack in her composure that everyone could hear. In the back of her mind, she knew this wasn't the reception she had expected. She thought the crowd would laugh along, maybe even cheer her on, that they'd find it as funny as she did. But now, under their disapproving stares, she felt smaller, almost embarrassed. The silence stretched on, and she shifted her feet uncomfortably, her eyes darting around, as if looking for an escape. Marcus's gaze remained steady, piercing through her false bravado. He had learned over the years that silence could be more powerful than words, that a simple look could communicate what speeches couldn't. And right now, his silence was telling her everything she needed to know. Without saying a word, he conveyed the dignity and pride he felt for his role, the boundaries she had so carelessly crossed, and the respect she had failed to show. A few murmurs rippled through the crowd as people began whispering to each other, casting glances between Marcus and the tourist. The tension was palpable, like the air before a storm, and everyone seemed to be holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The woman felt the pressure building, her heart pounding as she realized that this situation was spiraling out of her control. Her friend, sensing her unease, tugged at her arm, whispering urgently, "Let's go. Seriously, we need to go." But she shook him off, too stubborn to back down now. Leaving would mean admitting that she was in the wrong, and she wasn't ready to do that. Instead, she turned back to Marcus, searching for a way to break the silence, to regain the upper hand. But his unwavering gaze met hers, steady and calm, and she found herself faltering, unsure of what to say. At that moment, Marcus took a single, deliberate step forward. It was a small movement, barely noticeable to some, but to the woman, it was as if a line had been drawn in the sand. Her eyes widened, and she took a step back, feeling a strange combination of fear and embarrassment. For the first time, she was beginning to understand that her actions had consequences. The crowd watched, silent and captivated, as the tension between the guard and the tourist reached a boiling point. The young girl in the crowd clutched her father's hand, her eyes wide as she looked up at him for an explanation. Her father placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder, but he, too, seemed uncertain of what would happen next. As Marcus continued to stand tall, his silence was a reminder of the strength and resolve that came with his position. But he also knew that he was more than his uniform, that he was a person with boundaries and self-respect. And today, he wasn't going to let anyone take that away from him. The tourist swallowed, her throat dry as she struggled to maintain her composure. The crowd's eyes were still on her, and now there was a glimmer of pity mixed in with their disapproval. Her boldness had melted away, replaced by a creeping realization that she had crossed a line she couldn't uncross. She glanced back at her friend, hoping for support, but he looked away, embarrassed, unwilling to share in her shame. The woman's face flushed as she looked back at Marcus, and for the first time, she felt truly vulnerable. She opened her mouth to speak, to say something, anything, that might soften the tension between them. But the words wouldn't come. She was at a loss, standing there, exposed and uncertain, as the guard held her gaze, calm and composed, reminding her that respect was something earned, not taken. The uneasy silence hung in the air as the tourist continued to stand, now visibly uncomfortable under Marcus's unwavering gaze. She fidgeted, her bravado cracking piece by piece. She was used to getting her way, used to being the one who controlled every situation. But here, in front of this calm, unflinching guard, she was beginning to feel powerless. Marcus had said nothing, yet his silence spoke volumes, pressing down on her like a weight she couldn't shake off. Meanwhile, the crowd had grown, people whispering quietly among themselves, curious about the standoff unfolding before them. A few had begun recording, capturing the tension and the tourist's discomfort. Among the bystanders was a young man in his 20s, a local, who watched the scene with a slight frown. He'd seen the royal guards before, knew the respect they commanded, and was angered by the blatant disrespect he just witnessed. But he also knew Marcus couldn't simply react without risking his own position, his reputation. Why do some people feel like they can just do anything? He muttered to himself, crossing his arms as he watched the woman shift uncomfortably. He had seen it before. Tourists who treated the guards like they were props in a street performance rather than soldiers. But this woman's behavior seemed especially offensive, not just because of her actions, but because of the smug, dismissive way she'd done it. It stirred something in him, a sense of injustice that mirrored the quiet indignation Marcus seemed to hold. Behind the young man stood an older couple, tourists from a nearby city, who exchanged worried glances. They didn't approve of the woman's behavior, but they also hoped the situation would dissolve without conflict. The wife gently placed her hand on her husband's arm, whispering, "She'll leave soon. I hope." Poor man, standing there with all this nonsense around him. As the minutes ticked by, the tension only seemed to grow. The tourist, who had initially been so sure of herself, was starting to look more and more cornered. She glanced around, noticing the cameras pointed her way, the whispers that had shifted from curiosity to criticism. She bit her lip, casting a desperate look at her friend, who had all but abandoned her, standing a few steps back with his phone lowered, unsure of how to respond. Feeling the pressure, she turned back to Marcus with a defiant glint in her eye, attempting to regain her footing. "I mean, honestly, it's not that big of a deal," she said, her voice louder than before, trying to sound confident. But her tone wavered, and the crowd could sense the strain beneath her words. It was clear that she was trying to convince herself as much as anyone else. But Marcus simply stood there, unmoved, his expression unchanging, his silence a steady reminder that some things were beyond her control. The young man in the crowd stepped forward slightly, catching the woman's attention. "You know, he's not just some performer for you to mess with," he said, his voice firm but calm. His eyes held hers, a silent challenge. The woman faltered, caught off guard by his unexpected intervention. For a moment, she seemed at a loss for words, her confidence waning as she realized how the crowd had shifted against her. "Why don't you just move on?" Someone else called out, a middle-aged woman with a look of disappointment on her face. "This isn't a show for you." The tourist flushed, feeling the weight of the crowd's disapproval settling heavily on her shoulders. She was cornered, her initial defiance slipping as the reality of the situation dawned on her. She had come here for fun, for a moment she could brag about later, a silly video to entertain her friends. But now, standing in the face of quiet strength and the quiet judgment of the crowd, she felt small, embarrassed. Still, something stubborn inside her resisted admitting fault. She straightened, attempting to save face, her pride unwilling to let her back down. "It's just a job, right?" she muttered, mostly to herself, though loud enough for those around her to hear. "He probably doesn't even care." The young man shook his head, his expression a mixture of frustration and pity. "You just don't get it, do you?" he said softly, not expecting an answer. He turned away, joining the others who had decided to stay and observe quietly. The tourist stood there, feeling more isolated than ever, her friends still lingering at a distance, unwilling to intervene. Suddenly, the silence was broken by a small voice. A little girl in the crowd who tugged on her father's sleeve, her innocent curiosity cutting through the tension. "Daddy, why is she being so mean to the guard?" she asked, her wide eyes fixed on the woman. The father knelt down, his expression gentle as he looked at his daughter, choosing his words carefully. "Sometimes, sweetheart," he said softly, "people don't understand how important it is to show respect. But he's doing the right thing by staying calm." The tourist overheard the exchange, her cheeks flushing a deeper shade of red. For the first time, she seemed genuinely unsettled, her gaze dropping to the ground. She hadn't expected the crowd's reaction, hadn't anticipated the quiet judgment that now surrounded her. In her mind, she had been the one in control, but now, stripped of her bravado, she was left with nothing but the weight of her actions and the watchful eyes of strangers. Marcus, still as composed as ever, sensed the change in her. His silence hadn't just been about duty. It had been his way of letting her see herself, to reflect her own behavior back at her. It wasn't the reprimand of words, but the quiet strength of a man who knew who he was, who understood the dignity of his position, and had no need to lower himself to her level. The crowd began to disperse, though a few lingered, still watching, waiting to see if she would apologize, if she would finally understand the impact of what she had done. The young man cast her one last look before shaking his head and walking away, while the father and daughter held hands, exchanging a knowing glance before stepping back into the flow of tourists. Left with no one to look to, the woman felt a strange hollowness settle over her. She had come here expecting something entirely different, a moment of harmless fun, a memory to share with her friends. But instead, she was left with the sting of shame, the unfamiliar feeling of having crossed a line she hadn't known existed. She didn't know how to respond, didn't know what to say to make it right. She took a step back, casting one last glance at Marcus, hoping he would forgive her without words. But he remained silent, his gaze steady, leaving her to wrestle with her own conscience. With a quiet sigh, she turned, her steps slow and uncertain, the weight of her actions heavy on her shoulders. The crowd moved on, the moment fading as quickly as it had come, leaving Marcus standing tall. His silence a lasting reminder of a dignity that could not be shaken. As the tourist turned to walk away, the silence thickened, and a new uneasy tension settled over the square. Just when it seemed the incident might end with nothing more than lingering discomfort, a ripple of murmurs rose from the crowd. It was the young man from earlier who hadn't gone far. He doubled back, a determined look on his face as he stepped forward, this time to confront the woman more directly. She froze, sensing that the eyes of the crowd had once again shifted to her. "Wait," he called out, his voice carrying a calm but unmistakable edge. He approached, his gaze unwavering, radiating a quiet authority that she couldn't ignore. "You think you can just walk away after everything." His words weren't loud, but they struck with a power that seemed to halt everyone in their tracks. The tourist's face flushed. She wasn't used to being challenged, especially by a stranger, and certainly not in public. She tried to respond, her mouth opening and closing, but no words came. All the confidence she'd had before, the careless attitude she'd shown when she first approached Marcus, seemed to vanish under the weight of the young man's stare. "Do you even understand what you did?" He continued, his tone cutting through the air like a knife. "You might think this is all just a joke, something you can laugh about later. But this isn't just some job. This is his honor, his pride, and you tried to take that away just for a laugh." The crowd watched in silence, captivated by the young man's words, feeling the weight of his anger, the righteousness of his stance. Even Marcus, who had remained silent through it all, seemed to be affected, his gaze softening slightly as he watched this unexpected defender speak on his behalf. The tourist shifted uncomfortably, her eyes darting around, desperate for a way out, but no one moved to help her. Her friend had drifted into the background, the phone he had once held ready to record now nowhere to be seen, as he avoided her gaze. "You thought you could get away with it, didn't you?" The young man pressed, his voice low but powerful. "You thought no one would say anything, that you could treat someone however you wanted and just walk away. But respect isn't something you take for granted." The woman's face turned red as she struggled to maintain her composure. She glanced at Marcus, who remained silent, his gaze steady but no longer as cold as before. For the first time, she realized the depth of her actions, the line she had crossed, and the impact she had made, not just on Marcus, but on everyone watching. Tears prickled at the corners of her eyes, but she blinked them away, too proud to show any real vulnerability. She took a shaky breath, still desperate to salvage some ounce of dignity, to somehow justify her actions. But as she opened her mouth to speak, she could feel the eyes of the crowd on her, waiting, expecting her to finally show some remorse. In that moment, she felt completely exposed, as if the weight of the world was pressing down on her. All the laughter and mockery she'd thrown at Marcus now felt hollow and cruel, like a mirror reflecting her own flaws. And Marcus, who had said nothing, who had stood firm through everything, had become an unbreakable figure in her mind, a reminder of the respect and restraint she had failed to show. But the young man wasn't finished. His words, once measured, now held an intensity that resonated with everyone in the square. You know, he doesn't have to say a word. His silence is enough to show you who he is, what he stands for. But you've shown us who you are, too. The tourist's lips trembled as she struggled to process his words, to find some way to respond. The reality of her actions had finally set in, but she didn't know how to make it right, didn't know how to undo what she'd done. She cast a pleading look at Marcus, as if hoping for some sign of forgiveness, but his expression remained unreadable, his silence a reminder of the boundary she had crossed. The crowd, sensing the weight of the moment, fell silent, watching as the woman stood there, paralyzed by a sense of shame and regret she hadn't expected to feel. For the first time, she understood the power of respect, the gravity of her actions, and the dignity she had tried to strip away from Marcus without ever understanding what it meant. Then slowly, Marcus shifted. It was a small movement, almost imperceptible, but it was enough to draw everyone's attention. He took a deep breath, his gaze softening as he looked at her, not with anger or disdain, but with a quiet resolve that spoke of his own strength and compassion. The woman stared at him, her heart pounding as she waited, hoping, almost praying, that he would say something, anything, to ease the tension, to lift the weight of her guilt. But Marcus remained silent, his posture calm, his dignity unshaken. In his silence, he had said everything that needed to be said. She knew, at that moment, that no apology would erase her actions, but perhaps, in accepting his quiet strength, she could begin to understand the value of respect. The crowd watched, captivated by the standoff, the intensity of the emotions lingering in the air like a storm about to break. Every eye was on them, waiting to see if the tourist would finally understand, if she would finally take responsibility for what she'd done. And as the tension reached its peak, everyone felt the weight of the moment, the power of silence, the dignity of restraint, and the lesson in respect that had been silently taught by a man who had never needed to say a word. Just as the woman stood there, grappling with her emotions and the judgment from the crowd, a sudden voice broke through the silence, a soft yet commanding voice, one that immediately shifted the focus of everyone present. An elderly woman, dressed in a neatly pressed coat with a small British flag pin on her lapel, stepped forward. She looked dignified, wise, and carried an air of experience that commanded respect. Her presence was enough to catch everyone's attention, including Marcus's. He shifted his gaze toward her, and for the first time, a hint of recognition flashed in his eyes. The elderly woman's calm, measured steps seemed to quiet the restless energy of the crowd. She approached the tourist with a soft, understanding expression, as if she could see through the layers of defiance and discomfort that masked the woman's face. With a gentle but steady voice, she spoke to the tourist, who looked startled, almost shrinking under the unexpected attention. "Do you realize what you've done?" the woman asked, her tone kind yet firm. "This isn't just a matter of fun or a quick joke for a video. When you touched him, when you disrespected his duty, you disrespected something far greater than you can see." The tourist, caught off guard, struggled to form a response, her mind racing as she tried to understand the significance of this woman's words. She had felt the impact of the young man's anger, the judgment of the crowd, but this felt different. This woman spoke with a knowledge and authority that made her heart race, a strange sense of guilt creeping in. The elderly woman continued, her voice soft but resonant. "Do you know what it takes to stand there, unwavering, with everyone watching, and to hold your ground with dignity? To bear the responsibility of representing not only yourself, but a history, a tradition, a legacy." She glanced at Marcus, her eyes softening with a mixture of pride and respect. "This is more than a job. It's a commitment, a part of who he is. The crowd watched, completely captivated by her words, as the tourist slowly began to understand the gravity of her actions. She glanced nervously between the elderly woman and Marcus, feeling the weight of their shared history, their silent bond. It was as if, for the first time, she could see beyond the uniform, beyond the quiet expression, and truly see Marcus as a person with his own story, his own sense of pride and purpose. Just then, as if the moment couldn't grow any more intense, a surprising turn of events unfolded. The elderly woman, who had seemed like a bystander until now, reached into her coat and produced an official-looking badge. She held it up for the crowd to see, revealing herself to be a retired member of the royal service, someone who understood the honor and responsibility that came with serving as a guard. Gasps rippled through the crowd as everyone realized the depth of her connection to Marcus and the tradition he represented. Even Marcus himself looked taken aback, his steady demeanor faltering for a moment as he met her gaze with a newfound respect. "Many years ago, I stood where you stand now," she said, turning her gaze to Marcus. "I know what it's like to feel that weight, to carry the legacy with pride." She paused, looking back at the tourist, her expression softening. "But I also know what it's like to make mistakes, to not understand the value of respect until you've seen its importance through another's eyes." The woman's words hung in the air, resonating deeply with everyone present. It was a second chance, an unexpected reminder that respect wasn't just a rule to follow. It was a gift, something precious that could be given and taken away in an instant. The tourist's face softened, her defensive posture fading as she began to see the true impact of her actions. She realized that this moment wasn't just about a guard in a red uniform or a video she could laugh about later. It was about something much bigger, a shared sense of honor and respect that connected people across generations. Her eyes filled with tears as she looked back at Marcus, the weight of her actions finally sinking in. As the crowd watched, they could feel the atmosphere shifting, the tension transforming into something more profound. They weren't just bystanders to an argument. They were witnesses to a powerful moment of self-reflection and redemption, a reminder of the values that bound them all together. But before anyone could react, the elderly woman took one final step forward, placing a gentle hand on the tourist's shoulder. "It's never too late to show respect," she said quietly, her words filled with a gentle forgiveness. "And it's never too late to make things right." The crowd held its breath, waiting to see how the tourist would respond, knowing that the choice she made in that moment would define her character in the eyes of everyone present. She looked at Marcus, at the elderly woman, and then back at the crowd, her heart pounding as she realized the opportunity she'd been given. A chance to finally understand the value of respect and honor, and to make amends for her actions. But just as the moment reached its peak, a loud shout from the back of the crowd broke the silence, snapping everyone's attention away from the quiet intensity of the scene. A tourist had stepped forward, a phone in hand, capturing everything that had just unfolded. The flash of his camera startled the crowd, and the magical atmosphere shifted, the raw emotion disrupted by the intrusion. Marcus straightened, his posture once again becoming stoic and unbreakable. The elderly woman's gentle expression faded, replaced by a look of disappointment as the reality of the world came crashing back in. The tourist, sensing the change, looked around in dismay, realizing that her chance to apologize, to make things right, was slipping away, overshadowed by the return of the onlookers, the cameras, and the judgment of strangers. But amidst the distraction, Marcus held her gaze for one last moment, his eyes filled with a silent understanding. And in that gaze, she found a flicker of forgiveness, a reminder that even though the world had intruded, the connection they had shared, however brief, would remain as a lesson she would carry with her forever. The tourist took a deep breath, her gaze lingering on Marcus, who stood steadfast once again, resuming his role as if the moment between them had never happened. Yet she knew that she would never forget it. She felt a pang of sadness, realizing that her chance to express a true apology, to make things right, was slipping away. The weight of the elderly woman's words still echoed in her mind, each one settling into her heart, planting seeds of understanding she hadn't expected to feel when she'd first arrived in that square. People around her were still murmuring about what had happened, some shaking their heads in disapproval, others looking at her with quiet sympathy. The elderly woman, having said her piece, gave her a final look, one filled with both gentle forgiveness and a reminder of the lessons she had imparted. Then she turned, blending back into the crowd, her presence like a brief, unexpected moment of grace that had now passed. The tourist, standing there alone, felt an overwhelming urge to do something, anything, to show that she understood. But how could she? She couldn't change her actions, couldn't erase the disrespect she had shown. She felt the sting of shame and regret wash over her, and for the first time, she realized that respect wasn't just something others were owed. It was something she needed to uphold within herself. In that moment, the crowd began to disperse, some people lingering to share what they'd witnessed, others moving on, their lives carrying them in different directions. But Marcus, still standing tall, remained in his position, his unwavering gaze fixed on the horizon. She watched him, feeling the quiet power he held, not because he demanded respect, but because he embodied it. The tourist took a hesitant step forward, her head slightly bowed, her posture humble. She didn't dare disturb him again, not after everything, but she hoped that maybe, just maybe, he would sense the sincerity in her actions, that he would understand her regret. She whispered, almost to herself, "I'm sorry." She didn't expect a response. She didn't deserve one. But as she turned to leave, her heart feeling heavier yet somehow more at peace, a small movement caught her eye. Marcus, without breaking his posture, inclined his head ever so slightly, a subtle gesture, barely noticeable to anyone but her. It was enough. That tiny movement spoke volumes, conveying a quiet acknowledgement that left her both humbled and relieved. As she walked away from the square, she felt changed, the lesson she had learned resonating within her. Respect wasn't a given. It was something earned, something sacred that connected people, regardless of where they came from or who they were. She knew that the experience would stay with her, shaping how she saw the world and reminding her of the silent strength in kindness and honor. Later, as she sat in her hotel room, she reflected on the day's events. She couldn't bring herself to look at the footage her friend had recorded. It felt wrong, a reminder of a moment she wished she could erase. But she chose to keep it as a reminder of what she'd learned, a memory of the people who had shown her a different way to view respect. In the days that followed, she found herself acting differently. She noticed the quiet dignity of the people around her, the small acts of service and kindness that often went unrecognized. She even made an effort to share her story with others, hoping that maybe they could learn from her experience as she had. And while she could never fully undo her actions, she found a kind of peace in knowing that she could live her life with more empathy and understanding, that she could respect others as she had come to respect herself. Months later, back in her home country, she received a small package in the mail. It had no return address, only a simple note inside with 3 words: "Respect is silent." Alongside it was a miniature figure of a guard, standing tall and proud. She smiled, knowing it was a gentle reminder, a small gesture from someone who understood her journey. The moment may have passed, the square now filled with new faces and new stories, but the lesson lingered, quietly changing her life. And as she placed the miniature on her shelf, she felt a sense of closure, knowing that the values she had learned that day would stay with her forever, guiding her in ways she couldn't yet imagine.